All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more practically about some pain and injury stuff, specifically in the context of actually doing movement work, mobility work, all these exercises we see pop up as warm-ups and cool-downs in people's training programs, maybe some influencers on Instagram peddling mobility information, some physical therapy adjacent continuing education courses that have gained some traction in fitness communities like DNS and PRI. So we're going to try to break down what is actually valuable about this stuff, where it potentially fits in training programs, where some of it's overrated, where some of it's underrated, and hopefully give folks some valuable, actionable takeaways from that. So Luke, I know that you have been experiencing some injuries, are kind of in a state where you're like mixing and matching what you can do, trying to do maybe a little bit of CrossFit, maybe a little bit of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, working in some of this movement work type of stuff into your training. What's the story, right? Because I think that like an actual tangible case study here might be useful for people.
Yeah, so I think I've always had some element of you could say movement prep work with my training, which I think I generally have a good interest in that, and I suppose having certain issues with shoulders, elbows, knees, and all of this type of stuff, I've paid attention to the mobility drills that I needed to do, and then bit by bit, it eventually got to a point where I'm like, okay, well, how can I target this through a bit of a different approach? Maybe it's about actually strengthening the area, but then trying to incorporate that into regular training can be quite difficult. And over the last year, I suppose my training inside the gym, I've sort of used warm-ups to implement the things that I'm going to work on. So I might be, doing something like working on dumbbell external rotations for a bit and just trying to sort of progress that in a similar way to how I would with training, almost sort of your typical bulletproofing, you could call it. But I've not necessarily found that to be super effective, and I still have issues coming up. And I think the thing that has been quite helpful for me has been having a bit of education from a physiotherapist, being told to rest, being given a bit of a timeline. So
Luke, sorry to interrupt, but like, what is the actual issue that you're experiencing?
Yeah.
Like, is it like, oh, I tore this, or this is injured, or like, I just feel pain when I do this? Like, what's actually going on?
Yeah. So so yesterday I pulled my hamstring. So I literally have like my whole leg in a compression bandage right now, but that is a minor thing. I basically have adductor tendinopathy. So it's essentially my adductor tendons and sort of around that area in sort of my hip as well, is just essentially inflamed when I go through some training. In jiu-jitsu, there's a lot of positions where you're lying on your back and you're sort of pulling something towards you, and you're sort of contracting your hip flexors and your adductors quite a bit. And I suppose generally it's just I've loaded that area up too much, and the load of jiu-jitsu and then also just like the dynamic movements that you go through have been problematic there. I have issues like in my knees and my shoulders where it's, if I'm not careful with how I load up my training, and if I'm just a little bit too reckless and I push it a little bit too much, then I'll get a bit of inflammation. But those things are somewhat manageable. But this adductor hip thing has been irritating because it's like, okay, pain level is now to a point where I have like difficulty sitting up from a laying down position. So just getting out of bed, I experience pain, just moving my leg and things like that. And I suppose one of the things that I've been working through recently is just, okay, this is where you need to rest it, try to give it some sort of subjective rating of like a 0 to 10. And my rule right now is to keep it below a 3. And if it is anything beyond a 3, try to back off of something or back off of it, and then just steadily build up the tolerance. And the work I've been given from my physiotherapist is essentially just like, okay, this is sort of the order of movements you want to go through. You're going to be doing isometrics for a certain amount of time. You're going to be going through some loaded isometrics. Then you're going to work through some sort of basic actual exercises, and then eventually get to a point where maybe you can do like a lateral lunge and work through that loaded, and then maybe get to the point where I'm able to do something like a skater jump where I'm bounding from side to side. Whereas before, when I was sort of directing all of this myself, I was like, well, I should do skater jumps, right? Because so I sort of jumped straight to the plyometrics, before even going through, those basic isometrics which are required. But with that as well, I've sort of started to have a look at some more PRI, so Postural Restoration Institute, essentially a guy called David Gray, Rehab, not the singer-songwriter from, I think, like the 90s. But anyway, he's yeah, do you remember David Gray?
Yeah, of course.
No? Yeah, all right.
Yeah. Are you referring to Gray from Grey's Anatomy?
No, like I forget. It was like a 90s version of James Blunt. Anyway, it was,
and I think he was also like huge in the UK, but not elsewhere, right?
Yeah. So that's I don't know. That's why I'm talking to you, John.
Anyway. No, I know who David Gray is.
Yeah. All right. But yeah, guys, just YouTube it. All right. Okay. It'll be great. Anyway, so this guy, I sort of found him on Instagram, and he has this program called Lower Body Basics, which he basically says like, hey, before people see me, I tend to want them to be able to go through this, this, and this. And what was interesting about it was just, if I have this issue, this adductor tendinopathy, and I go through this sort of sequence of isometric exercises, eventually go to plyos, and then eventually I'm like confident playing full sport, and I don't necessarily have to do any more type of stuff for this. If I get to that stage, what's to say that it just doesn't happen again? So what's been interesting is I've been paying a little bit more attention to some of the movements that through CrossFit, through just doing CrossFit, I haven't done for a long time. So working on things like trying to get actual good hamstring bridges from a position where you actually have your pelvis and your rib cage stacked, as opposed to just like, driving your hips through the air, trying to, perform like a bridge or a Nordic or something like that. And you've got this like huge pelvic tilt going on, which doesn't necessarily get the muscles working how they sort of should be in certain movements. So it's opened my eyes to that. And what I've tried to do is be like, okay, here are a couple of drills I find difficult, and I think I've just sort of neglected these movements for a while. So I'm going to start to incorporate them in warm-ups. On days where I'm in the gym, I do my prehab, rehab type stuff before or after the session. What I've tried to do is emulate some positions. So the isometrics I was given initially was basically just like lying down on my back and squeezing a med ball between my feet. But then I'm like, okay, well, what if I go into a glute bridge and squeeze a med ball between my knees, because that's a position that I will go through in jiu-jitsu? What if I do the same with my legs up in a 90-90 position and I actually sit up a little bit, so I get a little bit more of my lower abdominals involved in the movement? So I've tried to basically take some of these concepts from the prehab rehab protocol that I've been given, and then trying to match them up a little bit with the sport and the activity that I find challenging with it. And I suppose some of the things that I've learned from that I'm now sort of applying with, my athletes is, okay, we can go through, a lot of, say, for example, I have an athlete with knee issues. And I'm like, okay, well, we can try to get a little bit more blood flow to the area. We can try to warm it up a little bit better. We can try to get you doing reverse sled drags and all this type of thing, and strengthen the area and isolate it a little bit more. But like, what's the integration back into normal activity and back into the activity that's problematic? And that's where, going through, adjusting the actual training, making the training a little bit more focused on, okay, well, tendency, a tendency a lot of people have is they like, oh, I do these exercises and these drills, and then all of a sudden I'm just going to go back into what I was doing before. But you can actually change what you do in training, make it more specific to this idea of prehab, rehab, and return to play through going through things like isometrics in, say, a back squat. Say this individual with knee issues has a difficult time squatting under load. So it's like, okay, we're going to work on pause squats. We're not going to go through dynamic movement. We're going to get you to hold positions at certain areas of the squat. So I use like a 3-stop paused squat, which is pause halfway down, pause at the bottom, pause halfway up. And eventually that develops into going through slow eccentrics. And then that eventually develops into going through loaded variations. With Olympic weightlifting, you probably avoid those squat variations and you'll go through power variations. And then eventually, bit by bit, you're going back to the activities that are more dynamic, that are more loaded, and I think what you need when you are trying to return from an injury is not only just a protocol, a movement, a list of movements that you have to do every day from a physiotherapist or a coach or whatever, but you also need to be able to understand, okay, how can I get back into my activity and how can I bridge this? Because otherwise you're potentially just going to go back to your same position, or you might end up, I think I remember on the podcast we did with Phil and Jousey from Rebel Training, where he was talking about, okay, you go through this and you just sort of move the tendinopathy to another area of your body, because you might not necessarily be addressing the movement and you're just sort of addressing the what's actually hurting you, which I think is, that there is a need for that, but at the same time you do have to look at it a little bit deeper, and you have to sort of start to think, okay, well, what are the potential causes of this, and also understand that some of the causes and some of the things are just unanswerable. I pulled my hamstring yesterday, and for like half an hour after it happened, I was trying to figure out why it was. And I was like, is it because I pulled from the floor 3 days last week? Is it because I did this? Is it good? And then I'm like trying to figure it out. And all of a sudden I'm like, no. It just happened because it happened. And all I need to focus on now is getting it back to a position, which is, it was like a random accident, you could say, where I slipped. And that was it. So it's just sort of, I think having a bit of a process can be helpful, but then also understanding that this stuff is complicated, and it's probably I'd say is probably, one of the most complicated areas of coaching athletes in CrossFit.
So Luke, you're talking about go ahead, John. With your dry.
I was going to say, you are grateful that you're not a racehorse, because you would not be on this podcast by now.
What was that?
Like we'd have put you out of your misery a long time ago if you were a horse.
Man,
this is getting ridiculous now.
I am resilient / stupid. I just keep coming back. Keep getting knocked down. Keep coming back.
Some resilient people don't get knocked down.
Yeah, but I just listen to
Todd,
that.
You can make a serious point. I'm done.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was, rather than trying to belittle you, Luke, and threaten to kill you, threaten to take you out the rack like Old Yeller.
John's just threatened.
It wasn't a threat, it was a suggestion.
No, I mean, I'm curious about where all this stuff actually fits in, right? I mean, you mentioned some ideas about like warm-ups, you're doing actual jiu-jitsu, whatever, like sparring. Are you sparring currently, or are you too injured to spar? Like, what's the deal? Do you call it sparring?
Yeah,
rolling?
I mean, it was rolling, yeah. I mean,
yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's basically sparring without getting hit in the face. But yeah, that's basically what happened yesterday. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess I'm curious, right? I mean, so you're like, okay, I have these things I know I need to work on. Some of this is related to this chronic adductor overuse type of situation. I have a more acute hamstring pull. I'm still trying to do some stuff in the actual gym, maybe with barbells or dumbbells or whatever. So how much time are you spending on this sort of like rehab, prehab, recovery, return to play kind of stuff? And where does it actually fit into a training session? And where does it actually fit relative to your jiu-jitsu practice?
So I'd say with jiu-jitsu, I mean, I get probably about 2 to 4 sessions in per week. Ideally, I'd like to get 4, but with injuries and stuff like that at the moment, I've been having to go less. I don't really do anything around that. Maybe before the session, I'll do some of the breathing drills, some of the the pelvic mobility drills, and I have like a bit of a warm-up routine that I go through. What I've tried to do is just stay away from stretching though, because I'm just like, I don't think that's, although that you see a lot of people in jiu-jitsu sort of like pretty good at yoga poses and stuff like that. I'm like, I'm not too sure. I just feel like I just need to, because you're getting stretched all over the place in the actual sport. So I tried to just work on a couple of things there. Maybe 1 or 2 of the flexibility exercises, but the actual strengthening, the actual isometrics and all that type of stuff, I will either do before or after my session, and that is purely just based off of convenience. So it's like if I go into the gym and I'm like, okay, and I'm like trying to use the open gym area and one class is finishing and it's really busy, I'm like, okay, cool, I'm gonna crack on with my isometrics, and then I'm gonna get into the training when I have a little bit more space, or the other way around. So it doesn't really, I don't feel like it matters that much. I think one of the things I try to avoid is like, I have to do this every single day, because I don't think, like, I have been like that in the past, and I'm not 100% sure that that's like a useful way of navigating through something, because I feel like you end up just sort of, it's almost like wearing your knee sleeves too much, or, you know, always every single time you have to squat, you're like voodoo flossing your knees for like 10 minutes. It's almost a bit like that. So what I'm trying to do is be more okay with warming up less, doing the basics, making sure I'm sort of ticking off some boxes, you know, each day. But I would say I'm doing about 3 days a week of actual rehab exercises, and usually that is going to be before and after a training session, just lifting. And then the other stuff, I would say the more breathing exercises, the more mobility drills, I just fit that in where I can. I'm just like, okay, this type of stuff doesn't take too much out of me. It doesn't take anything out of me. All I need to do is just find a position where I can like lie on the floor, put my feet up on the wall, and maybe have like a foam roller or a bit of toilet roll that I can put between my knees and start, you know, moving my hips around in a weird way. And yeah, I mean, it doesn't take anything out. And I think that one of the things I hear in the sort of rehab, prehab world is when you do find something that might be effective, or something you just never done and you've overlooked and you might need to do, especially when it comes down to like breathing work, or, you know, maybe you're doing some simple hamstring activation type stuff, or wall slides for shoulders. Maybe you need to do some more dead bugs and bird dogs and all this type of thing. It's like you can fit that in when and where you can. And if, say, for example, you train 6 days a week, you've got 6 opportunities to fit it in somewhere around there. And then if you like to do a bit of cardio, easy cardio on other days or something like that, you can fit it in there. I think the issue that people have is they will do it every single day, maybe twice a day when they're initially injured. And then all of a sudden it's like, I'm going to stop doing it. And it's just like, if you can find a way to not go fully at it and incorporate it a little bit more often and sprinkle it in, I feel like that is helpful, because sometimes a lot of the time when you are trying to change movement, you also have to consider you have your training, which is your hour, 2 hours of the day, but you have all this other stuff going on as well. So I feel like, you can, we've spoken about how you can improve movement within the session, where you can do like clusters of, okay, I'm going to do some squats, and then I'm going to do this like hip rotation drill to get a little bit more movement through it. And what you're trying to do there is bridge and make it specific. And I think that if, say, for example, I'm sat down at a desk for 3 hours, I know I probably need to lie down on the floor, do a little bit of breathing, try to relax a little bit, foam roll, crack my back, that type of thing, feel good, and then twist around, touch my toes, and carry on with the day. And I think it's like, that's the type of mentality I'm trying to have now. Interestingly, like my dad, he sort of asked me for some help with his mobility and stuff. And I was like, okay, you're probably not going to do it. So I was like, what's the easiest way? So I was like, so I basically just said, okay, here's a mobility warm up YouTube video from like Eric Cressy. And I was like, do that every single day. I was like, you start your training off with a 500-meter row. I was like, as soon as you finish that, do that. And then go and do your Pilates, go and do your pull-ups, go and do your, chins, as he calls them. And then, I like my chins, I do. And then, but then I said, okay, I was like, and if you do have time when you're at home, I was like, here's 3 different exercises you can do. One for your hips, one for your back, one for your shoulders. Just do those as much as you want to. Watch TV, crack on. And that's, I'm not too sure if he's doing it, not too sure if it's effective, but I think that's what I'm trying to do now, is look a little bit more critically at like, how can we easily incorporate this, as opposed to just hammering it and then stopping it altogether.
No, I think that there's a lot of insight in there, right? Because I mean, you're talking about someone like your dad, like you mentioned, maybe not, a ton of training background, knowledge, et cetera, surrounding all the details here. And in that case, maybe it is useful to just say, hey, listen, like, here's a specific routine, just do it. Because in that case, just getting in the habit of doing something like that and doing literally anything is probably better than nothing. Right. And then we have someone like you with long training age, lots of knowledge, transitioning into sort of like a newish sport for you, tons of background in a bunch of different stuff. In that case, then it's a little bit more nuanced where it's like, all right, these are the things that you, Luke, should actually potentially be doing, and I do think that there's a lot of analogies here with this kind of like movement, mobility, essentially just like movement skill work to other areas of skill acquisition, right? If we think about something like music, which I have some background in terms of practicing guitar, if someone is just new and sort of doesn't know what they're doing, it's like, okay, cool. Here's some very simple scale exercises that you can work on. Here's some chord transitions that you can work on. And then maybe there's a song that you like to play. Just like do that over and over and over again until you develop some basic ability in your fingers to do what you want to. And we don't need to get too fancy with what you're actually trying to work on. Right. But then if you have someone who's more advanced, who's been playing for a while, who has some idea of what's going on, then at that point, then you can start to be like, okay, you seem to struggle with this exact kind of thing. You should focus on this alternate picking exercise. You should focus on this specific passage in this song that you want to play that you have a hard time with. You need to focus on actually cleaning up your transitions between fingering over here and fingering over here because it's always sloppy, right? So as the person gets more advanced, you can get more focused in on a specific thing that they need to work on. And then we also run into this issue of like, oh, well, maybe I'm someone who struggles with this exact picking pattern, but someone else might not struggle with that. So then it can become a little bit more tricky to figure out exactly what someone should be working on, right? So similarly, if we think about, Luke, some of your breathing, this hip adductor that's giving you a little bit of trouble, certain positions that may be problematic for you, it's like, okay, cool. In this, new sporting paradigm of jiu-jitsu, you're in this position where you're laying on your back, like squeezing people with your legs. And you're like, all right, this is sort of a new thing for me. What do I actually have to do to figure out how to do this? And like you mentioned, some of this PRI stuff about getting the pelvis in a certain position and understanding how to spread the load equally amongst different hip rotators, adductors, etc. Like there may be certain positions there that are actually new to you and are very, very difficult that you need to focus in on and be like, all right, like I need to figure out how to properly get my rib cage in a good position so that my hip musculature is attempting to do this kind of like weird squeezing motion in a somewhat balanced way. Whereas, when you're doing rugby and CrossFit, like you may never actually be in that position, and that may not be something that's as much of a priority. So I do think that there's a lot that goes into the sort of like soft skills and intuition of coaching and being an athlete to figure out, sort of like you said, oh, this is something that's like weird and hard for me, and I need to actually focus on this.
Yeah, because I think when I started jiu-jitsu, I was like, okay, I need to find a movement routine that's going to get me really good. And because I was aware that like this was, very, a sport where you just put in weird positions compared to squatting and going overhead, which is, what you do in CrossFit, right? And I was aware of that, but I think I didn't understand just doing the sport, understanding how to get involved. I think it's load management. You call it load management in whatever sport it is. With runners, you got to be careful with how much you increase their mileage per week. With CrossFitters, you need to make sure you're not just being like, here's one set of, do a heavy set of 5, and then the following week be like, now do 5 sets of 5 that way. It's like having a basic understanding of those things is going to be important, and just understanding that the sport and the activity you do and the movements you do and stuff like that, you can view it under that like idea of load, and the way that we've spoken about that 10% heuristic in increasing intensities and stuff like that in training. When you are involved in an open loop sport and you don't necessarily have control of those variables that you would in, say, CrossFit, then that can be really difficult to manage. But it's just about understanding, okay, you just might need to be a little bit more okay with taking time off and doing this. Because one of the things that's been difficult is when you're injured in some sports, you just can't do it. And then when you're injured in CrossFit, if you hurt your knee, you can still work your upper body. Maybe you can jump on the skier. Maybe you can do a bit of bike or something like that. And there's certain things that you can always do. John, before we started recording, we were talking about people just jumping into their training just as normal, because they don't really take any time off, and part of that is because like maybe they still keep their training intensity as high as they can on other things, and then all of a sudden it's like So I think understanding, being okay with taking time off and understanding just sort of where the load is coming from and where the stress is coming from is really important.
One thing I wanted to ask you, Luke, I often find people have trouble balancing doing that kind of work before or after their training. So some people worry that if they do too much before their training, they're going to fatigue themselves and they're going to be at risk of injury. Or if they do it all after their training, they're already in a fatigue state and they're not able to do it as well or with as much control. Do you have any kind of, I guess, like protocol that you follow in terms of splitting that like rehab type work for before or after your other training?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose for myself, I'm aware of like, okay, I need to do this today. I can either do it before, I can do it after, and I know how to maybe spin it a little bit so that I can, maybe I'll spend a little bit more. Maybe I'll only do like 10 breaths of breathing work at the beginning of a session, but at the end of a session, maybe I do 20 because I know I've got time and I want to sort of relax a little bit. So I can understand those things. And I think that if people, generally, when you are getting yourself ready for training, you don't necessarily want to just spend like half an hour just doing movement drills and it was becoming like monotonous. But at the same time, that is a point in your training session that you will always do, right? You're always going to go through a bit of a warm up. So sometimes incorporating stuff into people's warm ups can be helpful. But yeah, I would say that when people are like, oh, I don't want to get too tired, I don't really think that that's the thing. I think you can warm up pretty well. Like think of, sometime, I've written sessions for people who are doing a qualifier workout that's only going to be like less than 8 minutes or something like that. And it's like they're warming up for say 45 minutes beforehand, just to get them going. And I know that sometimes some people can see that as overkill, but, I think that people underestimate their abilities in terms of how much they can actually tolerate in that sense. Because the stuff you're going to do for this generally is going to be easy. It's not going to be hard training. And then I think with if someone say like one of the things I can remember I would push back on with clients is they would be like, oh, I need to do stretching and I need to improve my mobility and all this stuff. And I'm like, which is the thing, but like I think it's very much an overvalued thing. And I was like, now I'm just like, if it makes you feel good, cool. Well, here's a stretching routine. I want you to do 5 breaths in each pose and just crack on with it and feel good at the end of it. And that's it. And it's just understanding the things that you want to get from the beginning of the session. You want to amp yourself up. You want to get ready. You want to feel good. If your knees feel better after doing this drill and then going and squatting, crack on with it. But then when you finish your session, you probably want to be like not doing the really focused work or, probably some of this PRI stuff that I'm doing is probably not best to do after a session because you're like, for me, I'm actually trying to physically feel what's going on because it's all new shit. But then stretching and breathing and doing easy stuff like that might be helpful. You just like sometimes if you see some people and they're just cracking on with like half an hour of core work and banded shoulder prep and stuff like that post session, I'm like, you're wasting your time. Like there is an element of stuff where it's like, you're wasting your time. Stop doing that. Like go home, rest and sleep and, like whatever. Play PlayStation, relax.
Yeah, I think that if we can help people reframe some of that, like you're saying, just additional core work and banded shoulder prep and all that stuff as some sort of like movement skill development, that's potentially more valuable. But that's hard to do, right? That you're not going to necessarily convince someone who has a very linear understanding of mobility of like, oh, I need to improve my shoulder range of motion, so I'm going to do this exact shoulder strengthening drill because allegedly my subscap is weak, and I'm going to do this exact shoulder stretch because allegedly I'm missing this many degrees of range of motion. Then it's going to be a little bit difficult to then convince that person that what they should actually be doing is some like weird breathing drill. Right. Like that's like a pretty big gap to bridge for them. But there is potentially some value in helping that person think about it as like a movement skill development session that they can tack on, sort of like you're saying, Luke, in your own training, right? It seems to be working reasonably well. And just sort of also allowing them to do some stuff that, feels good. Since if it feels good, hey, they're going to keep doing it.